Ever feel like history class kind of skipped over some stuff? Like maybe even whole chapters?
I know what you mean.
Well, you ready? Because today we're diving deep into one of those overlooked parts of history, the shadowy world of Cold War espionage, and specifically how it played out in Latin America.
Sounds intense. Where are we starting?
Our guide is Jorge Majfud and his book, The Wild Frontier. And let me tell you, this is not your average history book.
Oh, I love when a book challenges the usual narratives. What makes this one different?
Majfud doesn't just tell the story. He, like, peels back the layers of what we've been told, especially by, mainstream media in Latin America, and uncovers this pattern of covert CIA operations that really shaped the fate of entire nations.
Wow, that's a bold claim. What kind of operations are we talking about here?
Think coups, propaganda, the whole shebang. And the way he connects these events, it makes you question everything.
Okay, you've piqued my curiosity. Give me an example.
All right, so he draws this direct line between events that seem totally unrelated. At first, the coup in Iran in '53, then Guatemala in '54, and even the Cuban Revolution a few years later in '59. It's like, he's piecing together this historical puzzle right in front of us.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this is different. It's not just a timeline of events, but like you said, an expose of the forces working behind the scenes.
Exactly. And it all comes down to the CIA's playbook, their go-to moves for regime change.
Hmm.
To show us just how deep this goes, Majfud uses the example of David Atlee Phillips, a CIA agent operating in Chile in the late 1940s.
Oh, I've heard of Phillips. He wrote that memoir, right? Spilled some secrets, if I remember
Oh,
correctly.
yeah, he did. And he even admitted to some pretty wild tactics. We're talking planting stories in newspapers.
That's just straight up propaganda, classic
Oh,
stuff.
it gets wilder. He even messed with horoscopes.
Wait, what? Like astrology columns?
Yep, manipulated them to influence
Oh,
people. Like if they wanted to turn someone, they'd make sure their horoscope was looking good.
seriously. They were messing with people's destinies based on star signs. That's next level manipulation. Did it work?
Apparently. Phillips claimed he used this tactic to bribe a Communist Party member in Chile, promised him a rosy future based on, well, you know.
Wow. It just shows you how much they believed in the power of belief, how easily people can be swayed. And this wasn't just some isolated incident. This understanding of how to manipulate information, it's a recurring theme in Majfud's book. And it gets even more unsettling when we look at what happened with the United Fruit Company and Guatemala.
Ah, yes. Guatemala, the case that really gives the phrase Banana Republic a whole new meaning.
Exactly. Majfud argues that to understand the 1954 coup in Guatemala, you absolutely have to look at the economic forces at play, especially the United Fruit Company.
So for those who don't know, the United Fruit Company, sometimes called El Pulpo, the octopus,
Hmm.
because of how its influence was everywhere in Latin America, well, they were a major player in the region's economy, especially when it came to agriculture.
And they weren't shy about throwing their weight around. When Guatemala elected Jacobo Arbenz, a president who wanted land reform,
Right, because a lot of land was owned by companies like United Fruit, but not actually being used very effectively.
exactly. And Arbenz, he wanted to redistribute some of that unused land. Now, this was completely legal, democratic, the whole nine yards, but the United Fruit Company, they weren't having it. They saw their profits threatened and decided to, well, take action.
Let me guess. They weren't happy with a democratically elected leader making decisions they didn't like, so they called in a favor with their friends in high places.
You got it. And the CIA, whether directly involved or not, played a key role in how this whole thing went down. They were masters at shaping the narrative, controlling what people heard and read, and ultimately what they believed.
And that's where the master manipulator himself comes into the picture. Edward Bernays. He was like the OG spin doctor, right?
Hmm.
Didn't he convince women that smoking was like a feminist statement?
That's the one. Torches of Freedom, I think they called it. Bernays, he was Sigmund Freud's nephew, and a pioneer in using psychology to sway public opinion. The United Fruit Company hired him to basically demonize Arbenz.
So paint him as a communist,
Even though there's very little evidence to support that, Arbenz was more of a capitalist reformer, actually. But that didn't fit the narrative, did it?
nope, classic Cold War tactic. Anyone who threatens U.S. interests, even a democratically elected leader, boom, communist.
Exactly. And it's important to remember the CIA wasn't just working domestically. They also set up these clandestine radio stations to broadcast propaganda directly into Guatemala. One was called Radio Liberation. Catchy, right?
Oh, I bet. Pumping out propaganda and fake news, all designed to destabilize the government from the inside. Talk about a rigged game.
Right. And the thing is, this wasn't their first attempt at this kind of operation. Just a year before Guatemala, they used very similar tactics to overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran.
Wait a minute, so they perfect this playbook in Iran, where coincidentally, there's oil that the U.S. wants, and then they take it to Guatemala, which has, what was it, fruit? Land that the United Fruit Company wants.
It certainly makes you think, doesn't it? It really does make you wonder, yeah, what were the consequences? Because we often forget about those, don't we? We focus on the events themselves, but the ripple effects are huge.
Right, and in Guatemala's case, the aftermath of that coup was brutal.
Absolutely. The coup basically ushered in decades of military dictatorships. We're talking about tens of thousands of Guatemalans killed. Many of them were indigenous people who resisted the regime. It's a stark reminder that these covert operations, they have real-world consequences, you know? Lives are shattered, freedoms are lost.
It just feels like so often the people responsible never really face any consequences themselves, do they?
It's a pattern we see throughout history, right? But you know what's important to remember? There's always resistance. Always people who refuse to be silenced. And that brings us to Ernesto Che Guevara.
Oh, man, Che Guevara. Talk about being in the right place at the wrong time, huh? This whole Guatemala thing goes down, and there he is, young Che, witnessing the whole thing.
Can you imagine that? To be a young revolutionary, seeing firsthand a democratically elected government toppled, backed by a global superpower. That experience in Guatemala, it was pivotal for Guevara. It really cemented his distrust of the U.S. and just fueled his belief that real change, true revolution, required, well, radical action.
Yeah, like seeing that really opened his eyes. But how do we get from Guatemala to the Cuban Revolution? It seems like a whole different chapter in this story.
Not so fast. Remember that pattern of U.S. intervention we talked about? Propping up dictators and then, when it's convenient, just tossing them aside? Cuba, under Batista, is a perfect example.
Batista was essentially a puppet leader for the U.S., right?
Right.
But what was life actually like in Cuba back then?
Oh, Cuba under Batista. It was a powder keg waiting to explode. Batista, he was a brutal dictator. Human rights abuses were rampant. Anyone who spoke out against him, they were silenced, disappeared. And through it all, he had the support of the U.S. as long as his regime kept their interests safe, of course.
So while the U.S. is busy toppling governments in the name of fighting communism, they're perfectly fine supporting a dictator right on their doorstep. That's some serious double standards.
Right. It really exposes the hypocrisy at the heart of a lot of foreign policy decisions, the gap between what's said and what's done. And this hypocrisy, this double standard, it's something that Guevara, fresh off his experiences in Guatemala, he recognized it immediately.
So he sees the same playbook being used in Cuba, the propaganda, the manipulation, the backing of a brutal dictator. No wonder he was drawn to Castro in the revolution.
Exactly. And Majfud argues that to really understand Che Guevara's journey, how he went from observer to revolutionary leader, we have to understand these parallels, how Guatemala became a sort of blueprint for what happened in Cuba.
He sees the same patterns, the same forces at work, and he decides, this time I'm not just watching.
Exactly. And that decision, fueled by what he learned in Guatemala, it had huge implications, not just for Cuba, but for the entire region. It's a reminder that history isn't just a bunch of random events, it's all connected. Choices made in one place at one time can echo through decades and across continents.
It's like you said, those echoes, those patterns, they just keep repeating.
And the crazy part is we're still dealing with the fallout today. All that stuff from the Cold War, the distrust, the resentment, it still impacts how the U.S. and Latin America interact.
It's like Majfud is holding up this, mirror, forcing us to really look at the messed up parts of U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah.
But it's not just about pointing fingers, is it? There's this bigger message about information, how narratives get twisted and used.
Oh, absolutely. Remember what we were saying about Bernays and the CIA? Those guys, their whole game was controlling the story, shaping what people thought through propaganda, misinformation. They knew whoever controls the information, they control everything.
And it's not just governments and spies anymore, right? It's like, this is our world now. Social media, fake news everywhere. It's harder than ever to know what's real.
It's true, but that's why it's so important to be skeptical, to question what we're being told, especially when it comes to these big policy decisions that impact so many lives.
We got to recognize those patterns, those echoes of the past, like you said, because history isn't some dusty old book. It's alive. It's happening right now.
Exactly. And Majfud's book, it's a wake-up call. He's telling us to think critically, to challenge the stories we're given, and to search for different perspectives. We have to remember, history is written by the winners, so you can't always trust what you hear.
And maybe even more importantly, we got to remember that no matter how powerful those in charge seem, there are always people fighting back. Those stories, the ones that get buried, the ones about resistance, those are the ones that give me hope. They remind us that we can change things.
So true, and that's what I take away from all of this, that the future isn't set in stone, we have the power to shape it.
It's a powerful message. Well, folks, we've done it again. Another deep dive into a hidden corner of history. We dug into covert ops, propaganda, resistance movements, all that good stuff that shaped Latin America during the Cold War. From messed up horoscopes to Che Guevara's journey, Majfud's The Wild Frontier gave us a lot to think about. So until next time, remember to question everything, search for the truth, and never stop writing your own story.